Today, we're digging into a pretty provocative source text that asks some really tough questions about one of Christianity's most important figures, Saul of Tarsus, the man who became the Apostle Paul.
So the material we're looking at today, well, it doesn't pull any punches. It gets right to it with a huge question. Was the man who wrote nearly half of the New Testament actually a deliberate deceiver, sent to corrupt the faith from the inside? Okay, let's get into it.
All right, so here's how we're going to break down this argument. We'll start with who Paul was before his conversion, the church's #1 enemy. Then we'll look at that wild angel of light incident, dive into the whole law versus faith debate, and finally wrap up with his, let's say, contested legacy.
So where does the source even begin to build this case? Well, it argues that if you want to understand the apostle, you first have to understand the man he was before that famous conversion.
You see, before he was the Apostle Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus. And the source really hammers this point home. He wasn't just some guy who disagreed with the early Christians. He was a highly educated Pharisee and a zealous, violent persecutor of Jesus' first followers. And the book of Acts, which the source pulls from, it really paints a picture of just how intense he was. I mean, we're talking about a man who gave his approval for the stoning of Stephen, the very first Christian martyr. He was actively making havoc of the church, dragging men and women to prison, and he was literally breathing threatenings and slaughter on his way to Damascus to arrest even more believers when everything changed. And that brings us to the moment that changed history. But the source we're examining asks us to look at this conversion story not as a divine miracle, but as possibly a masterclass in deception. This story is famous, right? Saul is on the road to Damascus, and boom, a blinding light from heaven knocks him to the ground, and he hears the voice of Jesus. This is the event that supposedly flips the church's greatest enemy into its most effective missionary.
But now this is where the argument gets really interesting. The source uses Paul's own words against him. Years later, writing to the church in Corinth, Paul gives a warning. He says that Satan himself can disguise himself, that he can appear as an angel of light.
So, you see the massive question the source is asking here? Could that light from heaven that blinded Saul on the Damascus road, could it have been the exact kind of deception he warned everyone about years later? The author suggests this wasn't just some random warning, but maybe, just maybe, a clue to his own corrupted beginning.
Okay, so with that seed of doubt planted about his conversion, the source moves on to its central claim, that Paul's teachings don't just bend the rules, they actively contradict the Old Testament and even the direct words of Jesus himself. Let's look at the first example the source gives. In his letter to the Romans, Paul quotes the Old Testament, saying that believers will not be put to shame. But the source argues Paul takes that phrase and stretches it to mean eternal salvation, a meaning they claim just isn't there in the original text. It's like he's creating a new, simpler path to get into heaven.
And it doesn't stop there. Take the law. Leviticus in the Old Testament is pretty clear. A person finds life by keeping God's laws and judgments. But according to the source, when Paul talks about this, he slips in the idea of righteousness through faith. He fundamentally changes the requirement from obedience to just belief. The author basically calls this heresy.
And this all builds up to the biggest conflict in the whole argument, because here we have the words of Jesus, straight from the Gospel of Matthew, and he couldn't be clearer. He did not come to get rid of the law, but to fulfill it. And this right here, this is the heart of it all. It's a direct showdown. On one side, you have Jesus saying that not one tiny part of the law will disappear, and that those who break it will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And on the other side, you have Paul telling his followers that they are not under the law, but under grace. For the author of our source, this is the smoking gun, a direct, undeniable contradiction between Paul and Jesus. So if any of this is true, what's the fallout? The last part of the source lays out what it sees as the absolutely devastating consequences of Paul's teachings on Christianity over the last 2,000 years. And look, according to the author, this isn't just some dusty theological squabble. They claim Paul's faith alone doctrine created a kind of false easy button for salvation, that it's misled billions of people over the centuries, that it shattered the unity of the early church, and that it led to the rise of what they call apostate churches, churches that follow Paul's ideas instead of Christ's direct command.
So we're left with this. No one, and I mean no one, denies that the Apostle Paul's influence on Christianity is immense. His writings are the foundation of so much modern theology. But the source we've walked through today forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Did Paul's teachings take the message of Jesus and perfect it? Or did they corrupt it from the very beginning? That's the challenge this text leaves us with.